In a career with a pretty prodigious outlook, Song of Lasting Regret is probably Boyuji's most significant piece. It has been a remarkable story for generations, centuries of followers and fans. It inspired countless copies of the essential drama that he is portraying here. Most notably among them, probably, is the tale of Genji, written a few centuries later by Murasaki Shikibu. In it, he tracks a emperor who becomes infatuated with one of the women one of his wives, or one of the women to whom he has access, to the exclusion of all the others. And as emperor, he has a lot of wives and a lot of others, let's say consorts and whatever. And is a very elaborate and specific ranking system for that. But when he singles one out, says, "No, that's the one. That's the one I like," that creates a political problem, because he is supposed to be spreading himself quite literally, and being rather generous with his time across the board. So to single one out is an aberration. It is an abdication of his duty in a lot of respects, to create a kind of harmonious atmosphere within the palace. And his administration would be tasked with trying to keep everything simple and going, because the continuity of the line is so important. When you are the emperor, you're not just supposed to follow your heart. You're supposed to, well, okay, do what you have to do to ensure that there is stability of government after you leave. And that stability cannot be questioned every time an emperor dies and the line of succession is uncertain. Everybody needs to stay within their line, so to speak. And when you break out of that, it is politically troubling. But it is in the breaking out of that you see the humanity, where an emperor is more than just his job. He is a human being, and that tension creates great drama, great romance, and is an interesting way to study humanity in general from a sociological standpoint. But also, it produces, quite frankly, great poetry. You get great sense of you get a great sense of the art coming through in those little moments. The song, the poem, tracks the emergence of this love, this infatuation, whatever you want to call it, for from the emperor for this girl, and he starts to dote on her very specifically, and shower her with perks that none of the other women on his other wives or whatever, they don't get, at least not to the same degree. They're all living very comfortable lives, but it is the preference, the preferment, that is rankling someone. Rankling everyone, quite frankly, in the palace. And it is not just about his treatment of her and the special perks that she is getting, but reflects a much broader aberration within emanating from this moment. Boyuji writes, "Her sisters and brothers, older or younger, were enfeoffed with land. The most enviable brilliance and glory quicken their doorways and gates." So her family is doing quite well with this also. They're all getting, "Oh, okay, well, you like my sister, my daughter, my cousin, my whatever." Sure, the entire family gets land, gets money, is suddenly getting perks. You have walk-in privileges around the palace that nobody else gets. It's irritating some. It's rankling some. It seems to be out of order. Then it came to pass throughout the empire that the hearts of fathers and mothers no longer valued the birth of a son, but valued the birth of daughters. And that's where the rubber hits the road with this conflict, because it is about the culture broadly. The emperor is not just a man in the perspective that is being reflected in this resentment. The emperor is the figure of stability and of the culture itself. Now, that culture valued sons more than girls, more than daughters, because when you have a son, you have a sense of, okay, that is continuity of the line. A daughter is usually just an expense. Like, all right, well, maybe I can marry her off, but that's going to cost me some money, but maybe she'll make a good match somewhere, and, you know, it's not as beneficial. The reverse of that suddenly has that tacky feel of a family, in essence, pimping out a girl to the emperor or to any powerful person. So this reversal of suddenly sons being valued less than daughters, this is an instability within the foundation of the culture. And this isn't just about one man. This is about the entire society at this point. Now, you can argue that, well, you know, that's just wrong. That's just, you know, what about the girls and all? Sure, okay. That is true. That is accurate. And maybe Boyuji is being a little ironic here, and maybe he is pointing out that problem. It could be. He was a very clever guy about writing between the lines. And just the fact that we have to look at that and objectify the problem that way makes us suddenly say it out loud and realize, well, no, wait a minute, is that right? I don't know. There is that element to the criticism. But for the people involved at the time within the story, this is a great problem. This is a great conflict. And this is all happening in a time of turbulence. The An Lushan rebellion is taking off, and well, as things start to go a little badly, as military defeats start to accrue, and the tough times come in society, everybody looks for a scapegoat. And oh yeah, the girl gets blamed. The army stops fighting, refuses until do something about the girl. The halcyon-plumed banners jounced and joggled along, moving and stopping again as they went forth westward from the metropolis's gates, something more than 600 miles, and then the 6 armies would go no further. There was no other recourse, but the fluently curved moth eyebrows must die before the horses. Now, first of all, the eyebrows are a nice little metonymy for the girl, a nice little image for the girl, and it's also a sense of the superficiality of it. Okay, she is not being portrayed particularly favorably here. She is a made-up image that is somehow corrupting the virtuous emperor, so she has to go. She is the Yoko Ono in their Beatles band, so we gotta blame her. They decide that she has to die, but significantly they're doing it in very metaphorical terms, in very abstract representational terms, as the moth eyebrows suggest. Fluoriform filigrees were strewn on the ground to be retrieved by no one, halcyon tail feathers, an aigrette of gold, and hairpins made of jade. The sovereign king covered his face. He could not save her. When he looked back, it was with tears of blood that mingled in their flow. he stands by and lets them kill her. Significantly, though, it is spoken of in these metaphorical terms. We're never told that, and they took the girl and killed her. They were talked about the floriform filigrees, which is so, again, translation, especially from, that's a tough one. But floriform filigrees is a very conspicuous use of language in that those it seems artificial. It seems conspicuous and superfluous and artificial. Art, fake. The role of art in this is very suspicious. The role is very conspicuous. And this story, and I'm not sure where it's going with this story plays with the notion of art as distinct from reality. Because we are reading this grand love story as a poem. And how we read it is significant because that sensibility of the art matters. Are we reading this as a moral tale of an emperor led astray who then has to reassert the virtue of his government by getting rid of the corrupting influence? Or are we reading this art, this poem, as a love story? And a story of a girl who is swept up and destroyed in something much bigger and powerful than she is. It's uncertain. The emperor, in the narrative, the emperor is duly crushed by this. He is depressed. He hires a psychic to go and seek out the girl's spirit, and which is sort of entertaining and a nice little view on the spiritualism of the culture. But the spirit does that, and he goes to the spirit world, and he finds this door and he knocks on it. And okay, and he is told to wait. Okay, I'm just going to wait. And then he gets an appointment in the spirit world, and it's really very cute. And he goes in and he talks to her, and and she says that, well, I'm here now. I look down. I can barely see the world anymore. I can barely see the capital city. It's all covered in fog, and so it's all kind of gone. But what she says is significant. The medium, the psychic, asked for a little evidence that I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna talk to the emperor, and I'll tell him that I met you, but it's gonna sound a little skeptical. Can you imagine that? Who wouldn't believe the guy? It's going to sound a little skeptical. Can I have some evidence? So she gives him some jewelry some hairpins and stuff that she had gotten as gifts, and she takes them and she snaps them in half and gives him half each, and says, "Okay, now you take those back to him." And he says, "Well, is there anything that you would know and he would know, but no one else would? Can you give me a little something that I can really prove?" That, give me a little insight to prove that, in fact, you and I met and talked. And then she says, "In heaven, would that we might become birds of coupled wings. On earth, would that we might be trees of intertwining limbs. Heaven is lasting, earth long standing, but there is a season for their end. This regret stretches on and farther with no ending time." He would recognize the pain. He would recognize the agony. He would recognize the love. And he would recognize the pairing of pain and love. She's saying that life on earth, it comes to an end. She seems to suggest even that life in the in the afterlife, let's say the spirit world, might have an end as well, but that the regret stretches on and further with no ending. And that's what it can feel like, I suppose. What does she regret in this? Does she regret getting caught up with this guy to begin with? Maybe. It led to her rather violent death. Does she regret that maybe Earth just wasn't receptive to their love? Maybe they were genuinely in love, and the reality of the situation wouldn't allow that. But that sense of eternal torment, which is what love can be, because it's so fulfilling and it exposes you. It pumps you full of emotions and makes you vulnerable at the same time. That vulnerability can be thrilling, and it's caught up in the love and the joy of love. But when reality strikes, when the bell tolls, when the coach turns back into a pumpkin, that pain lasts, and you never forget it. And that's what art can catch.